Thank you guys. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you here this morning. I absolutely love anytime that I can get into the Word, that I can study the Word out to my life group, who I think that's the Jan you were referring to online. That's my life group, love you. But I love to get into the Word, and I love to preach and teach the Word. So thank you for being here this morning and allowing me the opportunity just to share what God's doing here in John. And I love what we're talking about today. But there is one more similarity that we didn't talk about when Drew was up here. Okay? And that's Drew taught about 2 weeks ago, if you remember, and he taught about the things that have been going on here in Vintage, and that we're going to be on the same mission no matter what's happening. I took a screenshot actually from YouTube of him preaching, and that's interesting. I saw him preach, I'm like, yeah, that's a great message, until I saw what he was wearing. I literally own the exact same shirt that he preached in 2 weeks ago. I thought about wearing it this morning like I would wear what he wore 2 weeks ago, but I clearly need to run more marathons because I can't fit into this anymore. So maybe I should start running marathons because it doesn't work anymore. There's lots of similarities between Drew and I, and how we shop for clothes is really based on cost. Right, where we shop. Now, we shop at pretty high-end retailers. So that jacket we both bought at a high-end French retailer. It's called Costco, right? Costco. And then my shirt, if you look at the tag, that was the even higher-end Italian retailer. And that one was called Old-Ye Navy-Ye, right? So we shop at some really expensive stores because when we're looking at clothes, the cost of the clothes matters to us. And if the cost is too high, we're not going to buy them. Think about it. We always analyze things by cost. My brother-in-law is a financial planner. He is going to absolutely love that I'm mentioning this in my message. But he always talks to me about cost-benefit analysis, right? Like, what's the cost of something versus what you get from it? Cost-benefit analysis. I had a cost-benefit analysis moment last summer. So my family decided to take a vacation. My wife's parents were like, we're all going to go on a vacation. So we decided to do an Alaskan cruise. And so we were planning this Alaskan cruise, and we were looking at what to do. We saw this excursion. Now, to understand this story, you have to understand my daughter. So I have two kids. I have an 11-year-old girl and a 13-year-old son who are definitely not in this room in this general direction so that I don't embarrass them. And I'm married here for 17 years to my beautiful bride, Jolie. So this is awesome. This year, when we celebrate our anniversary, it will officially mean I've lived with her longer than my parents. So we're 17 years. But my daughter, 11-year-old girl, absolutely loves animals, everything about animals. She's thinking about becoming a vet. She loves animal shows. She has a ton of stuffed animals in her room. Like, she is just an animal fiend. In fact, on the TV, when a cute or cuddly or like little tiny puppy type animal comes on the screen, my daughter goes into a different mode. She goes into what I call siren scream mode because she sees this animal and it's like, I can't even do it. Like, I would break my vocal cords if I did it. I am shocked that I don't have broken windows and glass throughout my house. I mean, she loves animals, how cute they are, and she just wants to cuddle them. So when we were looking at our Alaskan cruise, I saw one thing that we could do was that we could go up onto a glacier and meet some dogs that did sled dog pulling, right? And then also you could go to the puppies. They were like raising some of the puppies, and you could play with the puppies because it socializes them for the breeder, but you could play them and let them crawl all over you. I'm like, I got to do this. My daughter would freak out. Like, this is so cool. I wanted to do it 100% in because I hadn't heard the cost yet, right? My wife was like, okay, to get us up there, it's $600. I'm like, $600? Okay, like, I'm in. That's fine, $600. And then the bomb per person. 4 of us, 6, carry $2,400 to go on a block of ice to play with some stupid flea bag mongrels? No. The cost was not worth it. Right? When you heard the cost, the idea was great, but the cost wasn't worth it. You know, when Drew preached 2 weeks ago, he talked about how awesome things have been going. Have things been going really cool? We had more baptisms in 2020 than we did in a previous year, and that was a pandemic year. Thank you, yes. This is audience participation point. Yeah, that's so cool. Our life groups are growing, right? We got this new building. We're in the new building. Is this a beautiful building? This is beautiful. So it's a semi-beautiful building. Is it a beautiful building? Yeah. There we go, right? The community is noticing, right? Oh, you go to Vintage Grace? I know that's that one on the corner that just built the church, right? Oh yeah, I love that church. That's I love Drew, right? I was talking to Daisy a couple weeks ago. I was like, how is the junior high group and the high school group doing in a pandemic? Are you guys hurting? And he's like, dude. And that's exactly what Daisy says, right? Dude. He's like, dude, it's exploding. We've had more people that we can't contain it. It's growing so big. God is moving. It is so cool to be a part of Vintage Grace, right? You have no idea what I just did. Set up. It is easy to follow Jesus when there's no cost. Yeah, I go to Vintage Grace. That church is awesome, right? It's easy. What the disciples are going to be faced with today in the text is the same question we need to start grappling with. What if the cost was no longer low, but the cost started rising? What if it cost us something to follow Jesus or go to Vintage Grace, like friends, family, jobs? What happens when the cost rises? That's what we're talking about this morning. We're going to start in John chapter 6. If you've got your Bibles, go ahead and open them or turn them on, as I do, because we're in the new age of electronic Bibles. And we're going to look at John chapter 6. We're going to be in 15, where Daisy left off last week. And this is what John 6:15 says. Perceiving that they were about to come and take him by force, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea coming near the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Amen. That's right. You know this story, right? If you grew up in the church, like, oh, this is Jesus walking on water. I know this story. In fact, this is such a popular story. 3 out of the 4 gospel writers decided to include it in their gospel. A couple did different organizations of where this happened, but 3 out of 4, that's pretty good. Right? Last week's story, feeding of the 5,000, actually is the only story in the New Testament Gospels, besides the crucifixion and the resurrection, which kind of are important stories. That's the only story, the feeding of the 5,000, to occur in all 4. So what we're learning about here was really important to the gospel writers. They want us to see, and yet they all tell it a little bit differently. And as we're studying John, we have to understand what it is that John wants us to see. How does he tell the story? Okay? So he starts telling us that something's starting to change. He says, Jesus perceiving that this is the Jews that were at the feeding of the 5,000, were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain. Now this is weird, but it would make sense if you were an original reader, because what's going on right now is that the people knew what was happening and said, oh, this guy is awesome, right? Jesus has had like a Vintage Grace moment. So think about where we've been so far. John chapter 1, great revelation. Jesus is the light coming into the darkness. He's the Word made flesh. And John the Baptist says, dude, that's the guy I've been talking about. You should go follow him. Many of the disciples who we're talking about today, right now, were following John and said, okay, I'll follow Jesus because that sounds pretty cool. Low cost, right? And then what does Jesus go and do? He starts doing all these really cool things. So he turns water into wine, party, right? Woohoo, 7th day, eternal wine party is what Jesus says. That's what I'm bringing with me. And the disciples are like, sign me up, that sounds cool. And then he goes and he starts to have these encounters with all these different people from all the world of the day back then. So he has this encounter with a religious leader, Nicodemus. Right? And Nicodemus, he speaks to Nicodemus and kind of helps Nicodemus understand what's going on. He talks some Yoda words in it, right? Like he's like, you should be born again. And people are like, oh, that's so cool. Daisy talked last week and he said, you're a nerd if you watch Star Wars? Come on, man, you are mainstream if you watch Star Wars. Everybody watches Star Wars. You want to know when you're a nerd? When you watch Star Trek. Now you are a nerd. My wife seriously just went, oh my God. Yep, Star Trek, I watch it. That's true nerd. But Jesus does some Yoda stuff, right? Like you got to be born again. Then he has an encounter with a Samaritan woman and talks Yoda again. You got to like worship in spirit and truth, man. And the disciples are like, yeah, this guy I can follow. It is easy. There's no cost so far. Then Jesus starts whipping out healing miracles, right? So he heals that official son, probably a Roman official, the political powerhouse of the day then, that center, and the official son was ill, and he heals them. How cool is that? The disciples are like, sign me up. And then he has an encounter with that lame man by the pool, the kind of social outcast. Like, what did you do that you were lame all your life? Something's weird with you. And Jesus heals him too. And the disciples are like, yeah, literally everybody that Jesus has had come into contact with, sign me up, this is so cool. No cost to following Jesus so far. But things change here. Because the Jews saying last week, oh my God, you are the new Moses. You like literally came from a mountain just like Moses did. You literally fed us with bread and fish just like Moses did. He did bread and quail. And you teach it, you are the new Moses. We need to make this guy king. Now, in this day, Israel is controlled by one of the world's most powerful empires that have ever existed, the Roman Empire. Still to this day, probably one of the most powerful empires the world has ever seen. They have conquered all kinds of different empires, like the Greek Empire, right? They conquered the Israelites. As a matter of fact, if you list all the empires they conquered, you probably have Greece at the top. Israel would be like 437 out of 438. Little tiny empire. Right? Conquering them was like stubbing the toe. Oops, yep, we could just conquer them. Like easy. So what do you think would have happened if the Jews were like, hey, Rome, word travels around, it's to Caesar in Rome, we got a king. His name is Jesus of Nazareth, a farmer who may be strong here in the spirit, maybe not so strong here. Hey, Caesar, he's our king. What do you think Caesar would have done? That's so cute. Oh, I love it when my little empires say that they have a king. Squash. You're gone. What were you saying? Now, what do you think would have happened to everybody who was like, Jesus is my man, I'm following him. I'm a disciple. That's what a disciple meant. I'm choosing to follow Jesus. Rome would have been like, oh, that's cute. Squash, 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 squash. The cost of following Jesus is rising. You can lose something now. Jesus sees this. Jesus sees what's going on. He sees that the world says, oh, I know who this is. We need to do this. That is not Jesus' plan, right? The plan for Jesus is not to be made king of Israel and then reestablish Israel. Jesus and God had a different plan. Okay? So it goes on now. What's going to happen? What's going to be the decision that the disciples are making? So when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and the sea had not yet come to them, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. So the cost is rising, and what do the disciples do? And I think this is different in John. The other gospels tell us that Jesus told the disciples, get out of here. Get into a boat, go, get out of here. John doesn't tell us that. See, what John tells us is that the disciples literally just kind of go about their normal business. They were fishermen. And fishermen back then, they fished at the evening, nighttime, or dark morning, or early twilight time, because that's the best time to fish, because their nets are big and bulky. And during the day, the fish would be like, yeah, that's a net, and go the other way. So they didn't catch much during the day, so they fished at night. And so the disciples are just like, you seen Jesus? Okay, let's just go down to the lake because we need to do some fishing. We need to get our daily catch. We need to do our jobs. So they're going about their normal business. And then, so here we know that they're going to cross the sea to Capernaum, which probably means that they're here on the east coast of the Sea of Galilee on a place called Bethsaida. Jesus has been at Bethsaida a lot, so this is probably where they were. And they're going to cross the sea. And as they're crossing, they're going to do some fishing. But then John goes on. He tells us that it was now dark. So if you've been studying John so far, right now there should be a yellow flag waving in your head. There should be like a warning light, dark, dark, dark. Because what does John mean when he says dark? Dark, and so much more. Think about John chapter 1. Jesus comes to a dark world. Did the world not have fire? Did the world not have light at that time? Yeah, it did. John chapter 1 isn't saying that the world was with no light. It was saying they didn't understand. There was no understanding. There was a lack of understanding. And into that, Jesus brought the truth. He brought understanding. Think about Nicodemus in John chapter 3. When did Nicodemus come to Jesus? At night. Now, what did that mean? Did it mean he came at night? Yeah. But it also means that Nicodemus didn't understand who Jesus was. That's why Jesus had to talk Yoda to him. It's not about where you were born, Nicodemus. You got to be born of spirit and like reborn. You have a new birth. Oh, darkness, light. So when the disciples are sitting there getting in the boat and John is saying, it's dark, he is winking at you. It's dark, dude. Get it? Get it? Get it? I think what John's trying to tell us is that the disciples are getting into the boat, going about their daily business, but they're confused. They don't understand. What did I just see? Like, did I see what I think I just saw? I'm sure they're like, Peter, were you like hiding 500 loaves of bread and 200 fish behind your back? I mean, really, there's no other way that it could happen. Like, they didn't understand. And then they were like, the crowds are telling us that we should make him king. Should we make him king? Like, is this the second coming of Moses? Maybe we should make him king. Like, is this the moment? They're confused. They're going back in their heads and in the discussion, what just happened? Because they're in the dark. And it says, check this out, Jesus had not come to them. Well, yes, he hadn't come to them because he's up on the mountain, but literally, Jesus had not come to their understanding. They didn't understand who Jesus was. Right? And none of the Jews who said we should force him to be king understood who Jesus was and what his purpose was. And then the text goes on. That the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Now this would have been normal. It would have been very normal. The ancient Near East here at the Sea of Galilee, it's at a very interesting part geographically. It's actually below sea level. To the west is the Mediterranean Sea, and cool breezes would come off the Mediterranean Ocean all the time. Over here in the east was the hot Middle East desert. So warm, hot air would be trailing across the eastern part of the sea, meeting here at the Sea of Galilee. Up north, there's a huge mountain range, and then the Jordan River carves this canyon. And so the winds would fly through these canyons and then kind of blow out here at the Sea of Galilee. It's really meteorologically speaking, and thank you to the teaching team, I was like, what is the science of weather? Meteorology, there's your answer for Jeopardy if you're ever on it. Meteorologically speaking, this is a hotbed. And what it creates are these winds that seem to come from all four corners and swirl around. In fact, the word that John uses for wind also means four corners. Like the wind was coming from everywhere and it was swirling around. They were used to this. Jews would be like, yeah, I know the winds of the Sea of Galilee. They can be dangerous. Remember, this is not a seafaring people. Right? The fact that I was going on a cruise that Rona canceled, thank you, Rona, that would have been crazy to them. You're going on the water for fun? Like, what's wrong with you? They're not a seafaring people, but they understood these winds. Right? But John tells us some details that are really interesting. They kind of stand out. First of all, he tells us that it's great. So the word there actually gives us our English word mega. Right? So this was a mega wind, huge wind. This is bigger than normal. And we knew the swirling winds, but this is a big storm. Then he tells us one of the most curious details, I think, in this story. He says that it was blowing. Okay. In your history of being alive, has anybody ever encountered a wind that didn't blow? By telling me it's a wind, I already know it blows. So why are you telling me that the wind blows? Hey, these things can kind of stand out to you and say, what is John doing here? Why is he telling it this way? And what you realize is that the word for blowing is the same root word where we get the word spirit. So every time you see spirit in the text, like Holy Spirit, it's the same root word. In fact, spirit means breath or wind. And so John is telling us the wind is blowing because he's telling us God is moving here. See, they didn't have meteorology back then. When storms came up, God was engaged in them. God is doing something here. And John is telling his readers, wink, wink. They're in a dark and like a spiritual wind, a spiritual storm is coming. So I imagine they're in the boat. They don't have an understanding of what's happening here. They're going back, what did you see? What did you see? And then they're like, wait a minute. If he's king, Caesar will literally come and take my land away. My family might reject me. Caesar might kill my family. Like, who knows what's going to happen? I could lose my life. I don't know if I signed up for this. That's, I think, literally what they were doing. The cost is rising. You see, there's great cost in the good life. Because ultimately, the way the world thinks, the way the Jews are like, install him as king, right, creates a tension. It creates a cost because the world stands directly opposed to God and his truth. That's where the tension comes from. It's not God that's creating the storm. It's the collision of God and the world saying, no, we should do this. And everybody else going, well, I don't know about that. And there's a storm that happens in this. One of my favorite theologians, his name is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He understands the message this morning. He understands easy faith. He actually was born into a German family in the late 1800s, early 1900s. What this means is that Protestant Christianity was almost assumed for him. In fact, when you think about like major nations that have supported Christianity, and like if you're going to go get your PhD in theology, you're going to have to learn Greek and Hebrew because, well, those are the languages of the Bible. You're going to have to learn Latin because Rome takes the church and early theology was written in Latin. Then you're going to have to learn German. So Christianity is a major player in Germany when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born. And he was born into a family that were Protestant Christians. His dad was a Christian, his grandfather was a Christian. So when it came about time for Dietrich Bonhoeffer to decide what to do with his life, it was kind of a no-brainer. It was easy for him. There was no cost. See, his dad was a professor of psychology. I think that's why I like the Bonhoeffers. Because like I'm a little psychology, a little theology, a little bit fun, a little bit psychology, a little bit theology. The Bonhoeffers were, right? But then his grandfather also was a professor of theology. So for Dietrich, he wanted to be like his grandfather, and he decided to become a professor of theology. And he became a good one, right? One of the world's best. There was a little cost. And then World War I happened, and that did not do well for Germany. And Germany was left destitute. And a man came to power in the German Socialist Party who said, dude, this is not how Germany's supposed to be. Like, we are a proud people. This world is ours. The world's riches is something that we should share in. We're the best people. Let's go get it. We need to take back our pride. His name was Adolf Hitler. You probably know him. And imagine at that day, this is Germany that is a Protestant nation. A lot of Germans said, sign me up. Protestant Christians, Dietrich went, I don't know about that. Like, we're talking about humanity and the power of people. Where's God in that? Where's the power of God We need to put God at the center of our life. It is very important to understand that Dietrich did not actively fight against Hitler, right? But he actively promoted and turned towards God. He said, what's ever going on here, I want to minister to my people. And the cost rose. What do you think the German Socialist Party did to people who opposed their teachings? It didn't go well for them. And Dietrich's life became in danger. And he became world renowned at that time. So some people all over the world, including in America, said, Dietrich, you got to get out. And he did. He traveled to America to escape the persecution that they were experiencing in Germany. He decided in that moment to turn and go towards America. But he was in America and he went, this doesn't seem right. The storm is raging in his head. I got brethren back in Germany. I got to go serve them. And he had a decision. The storm was in front of him. How did the disciples react to this? Where do we go from here when the storm rises? Well, it said that the disciples tried to solve it on their own. So they're rowing, and it says they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. I was reading it, and I learned some stuff this week. Actually, I think it's better more like 3.5 miles, okay? And so they're rowing. Why is that important? Well, remember our picture of the lake? We can measure distances. Google Maps is awesome. Right? Capernaum to Bethsaida, depending on where they left, is anywhere from 2 to 4 miles. So they had gone about 3 to 3.5 miles. They were almost there. They're like, we're there. They're rowing as hard as they can against the wind. Isn't that funny? When the storm comes, we try to solve the problem ourselves. Like, I'm almost there. They're rowing as hard as they can, but they can't solve it. Right? And it goes on. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. Remember, they're sitting there. The storm's going on in their mind. What is happening? Like, do I really want to give up everything? Do I want to give up my life? I don't think so. And then the object of that fear is literally right there, probably like a half mile away or less. And he's walking from the shore to me. No, I'm out. Like, I'm frightened. That's too much. And then Jesus speaks. And he says, I got to tell you some of the 2 coolest things when I was studying it in preparation for this. Just what Jesus says blew my mind. He says, it is I. Do not be afraid. And you're like, dude, he was just identifying himself. They already knew. They saw Jesus. So why did he have to say it is I? Now, normally we do not bring up Greek because you do not need to know Greek to read the Bible, and I completely agree with you. I want to bring up the Greek in this situation to show you how cool this is. So in the Greek, it tells us the words Jesus used were ego, eimi. Ego is I in Greek. Eimi is the first person for to be, I am. Did you hear it? I am. So the English translate, it is I, but it also, I am. Now think back. Exodus chapter 3. Moses is in front of God. The bush is burning. It's not being consumed. Guess what Moses' reaction is? Fear. He turns away like this is too much. And God says, hey, I'm going to send you to gather my people from Egypt. And Moses is like, no, that's too much. And he asks all these questions to try to avoid the issue. One of the questions is, dude, if you send me, what do I tell your people your name is? Ready for it? God opens his mouth and he says, tell my people, ego eimi ha'an in the Greek. Same words. I am that I am. So Jesus is crossing the sea. The disciples are freaking out. This is the new Moses. And literally Jesus' first words are, I am. Whoa, this is not Moses. Because Moses didn't say I am. And then we go to the second phrase. In the Bible, when the people of God are most afraid, most vulnerable, can you guess what God says to his people all the time? So like Jacob, he's supposed to go down to Egypt because of the famine, and Jacob's freaked out because Egypt is dangerous. Guess what God tells Jacob? Do not be afraid. And then there's the positive version of this. Instead of do not be something, be strong and courageous. Guess when Moses was struggling with the people of God, what God told Moses, Moses, be strong and courageous. I will be with you, right? So Jesus, the storm is going on in the disciples' mind. He's walking across the water, and he literally says, I am, do not be afraid. Can I just tell you what the disciples did? What? Are you kidding me? And it says after that, they were glad. I don't really like the word glad here because it means they wanted with passion. It wasn't like, oh, come on into the boat. It was like, get into the boat. Like, please, passionately get into the boat, Jesus. Right, when the cost is rising, you've got to learn where to turn to. Invite Jesus into that boat. And they do, and look what happens. Immediately, it says, and this is another cool thing. It literally says, came, boat land. It's almost as if the land just came out from the water. Like it was water and land. I've heard that story before. Genesis chapter 1. Chaotic waters. God, by the way, in a spirit hovering like a wind over chaotic waters, has the waters recede, and guess what comes up? Land. It's as Jesus just said, I am, do not be afraid. And oh, by the way, remember what God did in Genesis 1? Pop. There's your land. And life came from certain death. This is what we call an object lesson, people. The disciples think we're going to die. They're on the ocean. They're trying to solve themselves. They can't. Jesus literally brings life from death. Where do we turn when the cost rises? When the cost of the good life rises, Jesus is the only one we must turn to in order to anchor us in the storm, or we will end up missing what John wants you to get in his entire gospel. True life in his name, the results of believing it. Remember the thesis? I hope that you believe in Jesus the Christ, the Son of God, which, by the way, Jesus just said, I'm the Christ, the Son of God, and that by inviting him into the boat, believing in his name, you will have life in his name. So cool, right? Such a cool story. So how did Dietrich Bonhoeffer respond to this? The cost was rising in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's world, so he had to make a decision. Was he going to turn to Jesus and invite him in the boat or not? And he decided, I have to go back to Germany to minister to my people. Whatever the cost is, I'm willing to pay it. And he did. He went back to Germany and he started ministering. And it cost him a lot. In 1943, the Gestapo arrived at his parents' house and arrested him and his brother-in-law and his brother. Put him in prison. He spent the next 2 years going from prison to concentration camp, to prison to concentration camp. It didn't say that he fell away in fear. It actually says that while he was there, he stood up and says, I'm ministering to you. I believe in God. He ministered to the people around him, stood up for his faith in the midst of prison. He turned to Jesus in the storm. And church, please tell me, or please hear me when I say this message. You may be thinking in your mind, oh, Hitler came to power. I get it. Hitler just came to power 2 weeks ago. That's what you may be thinking about. Or you may be thinking Hitler's about to be inaugurated into power. Church, do hear me plainly. This was not about Dietrich and Adolf Hitler. This was about Dietrich and God and where we turn to in the storm, right? Blue, red, purple, gray, I don't care. God, turn. That's what Dietrich did. And on April 9th, 1945, by order of the second in command, Heinrich Himmler, he was executed. Jesus came to him in the boat, and Dietrich looked at Jesus and said, I will literally give you everything. My family, my livelihood, my life. And this is not a success story by the world. April 11th, April 9th, April 11th, 1945. Armed forces from the Allied army arrived at the concentration camp that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was in. 48 hours Too late. Do you think Dietrich Bonhoeffer was like, Jesus, seriously, 2 days? You could have spared my life. I could have continued ministering. I could have been with my friends and my family. No. He was passionately glad to invite Jesus into the boat and say, yes, this is it. This is everything. I give up everything for you. That's what Dietrich Bonhoeffer decided to do at the cost of discipleship. Read what he wrote in 1937, 8 years before he died. In this book, The Cost of Discipleship. He said, cheap grace, grace without price, is the grace we bestow on ourselves. It's the preaching of forgiveness without requiring repentance. It's grace without discipleship. Costly grace is the call of Jesus Christ at which the disciples leave his nets and follow him. The gospel which must be sought again and again, the gift that must be asked for, the door at which a man must know. It is costly because it calls us to follow. It is costly because it cost a man his life. This was 8 years before he actually lived out what he wrote. And it is a grace because it gives the man the only true life. How do we respond when the cost of discipleship raises? And church, please hear me. I think the cost of discipleship is raising not because of what's going on in the world, right? When America was founded, Christianity was popular. Everybody was Christian. If you weren't, you were kind of weird. And we all thought the same, and we all voted the same, and we all went in the same direction. And then church historians thought about 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, people started going, well, I don't know if I believe in that. I don't know if I believe in any God. You know, I don't know, I believe in this religion. And we moved from what was called a Christian society to what we call a post-Christian society. Post-Christian society means we're not popular anymore. And so things vote in different ways that we're not used to, or people think differently than I think. Well, church historians are saying we may be moving into a new phase where it's not just that we're not popular anymore, but it may become illegal for you to believe in certain things that Jesus teach, whether you believe in Jesus at all. And you may lose something, jobs, friends, lives. What cost am I willing to accept for the good life? Church, we have to think about that this morning. What cost am I willing to pay? And what cost is too high? I gotta tell you, job, cool. Friends, I mean, that would hurt, right? I'm like a good male who watched Braveheart. Give me my life, man. That's cool. I'll sacrifice it for Jesus. Can I just be honest with you? When you start talking about sacrificing my family, ooh, that might be too high. What's your line? What cost is too high for you? Consider that. Because church, you need to pay attention. In 2 weeks, Drew's going to preach on the second part of this story, where the disciples are going to be in another storm. See, next week, Jesus is going to say, hey, I wasn't the new Moses. I was the bread of life. I was the manna. Eat me. I love that. Jesus is like, eat me. And the Jews are like, that's weird, man. I don't think I can follow you. In the very next story, the disciples are considering that teaching like, Jews are leaving him. Do I do the same? Is this the line? It's not a good story. Most leave, 12 remain. So as you're in the story today, I can pay it all. Be humble about that. I don't know. When the cost gets high, where did Dietrich turn to? Where did the disciples turn to? The question is, where do we turn to? Where do we turn to for answers? The world has all kinds of ideas. Oh, you believe in Jesus, but I can tell you historically that this doesn't make sense and this doesn't make sense. You believe in that? That's dumb because science tells us. The world will pull you in all kinds of different directions. Where are you going to turn? Because it's not like Jesus made me. It's Jesus or not. So where do we turn? And do I feel confident in understanding the things of God, my R1 relationship there? Which leads to the last implication. The cost is low right now. So take this time to put some work into it. At the adult ministries team, I'm called the Bible guy. They're like, oh, you study the Bible. Well, thanks, because you can help me. Guys, no. We are believers in God. We should all be studying the Bible as deeply and as passionately as we possibly can. Don't leave it to some other dude. Read The scriptures. Read some books about the scriptures. Develop your R1. Know what you are turning to when you get into that boat. Because it cost Dietrich everything. And he was so excited. So excited. What cost are you willing to pay? Church, I hope and pray that we are to pay the ultimate price all the way up, because Jesus is so much more important than that. So much important than going on in the world. He's so much more important than everything. He's the only thing to turn and get into the boat on. Not your red, not your blue, not your scientific theologies or philosophies or anything else that you think about. Jesus is the only one, and he makes sense. So I pray that you guys take the time now when the cost is low to do that, so that when the storm comes, we know who to turn to. Let's pray. Dear Father, we just thank you. We thank you for providing a way in the storm to have a person to turn to passionately believe in and to trust wholeheartedly. I pray for our futures, whether the cost rises or it doesn't, that we consider the cost of following Jesus and that we give God everything. We turn to him in the storm and invite him into the boat. And this week, that I just pray that you speak to us, encourage us, and remind us that you are